This video was produced for Newcastle Disability Forum's No Steps History Walks project, funded by the People's Health Trust, using money raised by the Health Lottery, North Eastern Cumbria.
War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength.
(1984). One of the most grimly prophetic books ever written. George Orwell's account of a totalitarian regime that crushes all freedom of thought. A novel as relevant today as when it was written in 1948. And a book that might not have been written at all if a Russian marine engineer had not spent a few months living in Jesmond. History is complicated. If you trace the connection between any one life or any single major event, you'll eventually end up with a web that embraces the world and pretty much all of the people in it. But sometimes the links are so improbable and strange that people barely notice them. And yes, what I just said about 1984 is true. If it hadn't been for a Russian naval architect living in the suburb of Jesmond during the First World War, George Orwell might never have written his classic dystopian novel. Before I go on, let's define dystopia, literally a bad place. Utopia we've all heard of. The literal meaning is no place, a perfect society that can never be. So a dystopia is the opposite of utopia. Popular modern examples include the Hunger Games, books and films, but there are lots of others. Having dealt with that, let's meet the hero of our unlikely tale. His name, Yevgeny Zamyatin. His job, marine engineering. He was born in Lebedyan in 1884, and in 1916 he was employed designing icebreakers for the Russian Imperial Navy. Zamyatin was sent to Newcastle to supervise the construction of several new ships. The first, the Sviatogor, was to be built on Tyneside by Armstrong Whitworth. All very interesting to a naval historian, but how does this connect to 1984? Well, Yevgeny Zamyatin was also a literary man, a keen writer who'd published some stories and also translated English books into Russian. He was particularly keen on H.G. Wells, author of The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds. So what we now call science fiction was of interest to the Russian engineer before he arrived on Tyneside. While he was supervising icebreaker construction, Zamyatin lived in Jesmond at 19 Sanderson Road. He later described the life he led. Often in the evening, as I was returning from the yard in my little Renault, I would be met with a dark, blinded city, all lights extinguished. This meant the German Zeppelins were about, and their bombs would soon be crashing down. At night, sitting at home, I would listen to the explosions, some far away, some closer, as I checked through drawings and worked on my novel about the English. In fact, Zamyatin wrote 2 short novels about the English. One called Islanders is specifically set in Jesmond. The second, A Fisher of Men, is supposedly set in London, but has in fact many features drawn from Newcastle. For instance, a description of a boating pond is clearly Leazes Park Lake. In both books, petty, small-minded members of the clergy dominate their communities, and people's lives are intensely regulated by time. Zamyatin, as a Russian, was simply amazed to see people all getting up and going to work at the same time, punching the clock at the shipyard, and so forth. Things were not done that way in Russia under the Tsars. It was this idea of a perfectly ordered society, based on the regime at the Tyne shipyards and the respectable middle-class neighbourhood of Jesmond, that proved a key influence on his third book. But first, here's an extract from Islanders, and the Church of St. Enoch's mentioned here, by the way, is the real-life St. George's. By Sunday, the stone doorsteps of the Jesmond houses had been scrubbed to a blinding whiteness. The houses were of a certain age and smoke-begrimed, but the steps were gleaming rows of white, like the Sunday gentleman's false teeth. The Sunday gentlemen were produced at one of the Jesmond factories, and on Sunday mornings thousands of them appeared on the streets with the Sunday edition of St. Enoch's Parish newspaper. Sporting identical canes and identical top hats, the Sunday gentlemen strolled in dignified fashion along the streets and greeted their doubles. "Lovely weather, isn't it?" "Oh yes, much better than yesterday." A description of the Tyne shipyards is fascinating too, because our Russian visitor had never seen anything like the huge glazed enclosures. He noted that workers dressed in more or less identical overalls and were issued with works numbers. At lunchtime, each man was given a numbered disc with males and females distinguished by different code letters. All of these things were to appear in Zamyatin's greatest novel as symbols of a soulless society, and his view of historic Newcastle certainly isn't what nostalgic locals might recall. All the streets, all the houses are identical, do you understand me? Completely identical, like the grain barns in St. Petersburg near the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. As we were driving past, I inquired, "What are these warehouses?" "They're dwelling houses." Next day it turned out to be possible to go to London. It was about a 6-hour journey, and the very same identical barn-like towns flashed by. Horrible lack of imagination. It's worth noting at this point that our man was quite an Anglophile. Zamyatin wore tweed suits, smoked a pipe, and was actually known to his fellow Russian intellectuals as the Englishman. He loved the Geordie accent, but struggled to understand it at times. The one thing he didn't like about English culture was its stifling conformity, as he saw it. He felt that people on Tyneside were too willing to follow the herd and do as they were told, and this planted the seed of a book he would write a few years later. By 1917, revolution broke out in Russia, and Zamyatin went home. He was a Bolshevik and supported Lenin, wanting to see an end to the war and better conditions for ordinary people. But soon Zamyatin, like many other writers and artists, found himself subject to censorship by the new regime. He didn't like the way the Soviets insisted on regimenting everyone, allowing little individual expression, while talking about building a more advanced society. He detected in their plans a society where individual freedom would simply be denied. It must have seemed as if everyone in the new USSR was expected to work in a kind of all-embracing version of Swan Hunter's shipyard, but with no time off, and the regulation enforced by the secret police. In 1923, he wrote a book attacking everything he loathed about the new Russia. The title in translation is one word, We. We is set in a glass-enclosed city thronged with nameless workers. It is in fact the first book in which characters have numbers instead of names. All activities are regulated and woe betide anyone who deviates from the official timetable. Children are indoctrinated by machines. Public executions are routine. And in another nod to the Tyne, the great project of the regime is the construction of a ship called the Integral. This is a huge spacecraft whose launch is the climax of the story. The ruler of the one state, as it's called, is simply known as the benefactor. The description of the tyrant makes it clear that he looks a bit like Lenin. The law is enforced by the Guardians, a police force based on the brutal Soviet Cheka. And the names of the two main characters, D503 and I330, are actually taken from the blueprints of that icebreaker we mentioned earlier. Not surprisingly, Zamyatin's book was not published in Russia until after the Soviet Union collapsed. However, he smuggled a manuscript abroad to a New York publisher, where We appeared in a very limited English translation. Then a Russian version was printed in Prague, and to the fury of the regime, copies were smuggled back into the Soviet Union. Zamyatin was held in such high regard that the government couldn't get rid of him, merely deny him employment. Eventually, he wrote to Stalin directly and asked to be allowed to emigrate, as he could no longer publish anything in the USSR. This bold move paid off, and in 1931 Zamyatin left for Paris, where he died 6 years later. And now, finally, we come to George Orwell, real name Eric Blair. In 1946, he got hold of a French translation of We, which he'd been wanting to read for years, and was suitably impressed. He wrote a review of it in the left-wing magazine Tribune. What Zamyatin seems to be aiming at is not any particular country, but the implied aims of industrial civilization. I have not read any of his other books, but I learned that he had spent several years in England and written some blistering satires on English life. It's evident from We that he had a strong leaning towards primitivism. Imprisoned by the Tsarist government in 1906, and then imprisoned by the Bolsheviks in 1922 in the same corridor of the same prison, he had cause to dislike the political regime he'd lived under. But his book is not simply the expression of a grievance. It is in fact a study of the machine, the genie that man has thoughtlessly let out of its bottle and cannot put back again. Later, Orwell borrowed many of Zamyatin's ideas for his own dystopian novel. The benefactor becomes Big Brother, the Guardians are renamed the Thought Police, and so on. But 1984 is a more overtly political book, and also much bleaker. Orwell offers the reader no real hope that his dictatorship could ever be overthrown. In Zamyatin's book, by contrast, there is a possibility that rebellious individuals can defeat technological tyranny. All of his stories are more satirical and playful than Orwell's, whether he's writing about vicars in Jesmond or dictators in a futuristic city. And that's how we get from Jesmond via the Tyne shipyards to the world of Big Brother and the Thought Police. It's a convoluted path, but I hope the journey was worth making. We live in a world where technology continues to demand mental conformity, sometimes at great individual cost. There'll always be prophetic souls who warn us of the perils we face, and sometimes they offer hope that the human spirit will survive.